Warden Helen Rodriguez stopped mid-signature, her pen frozen above the execution order as the words echoed through her office. "I want to see my dog, Thunder, one more time." The condemned man's final request wasn't for a priest, a last meal, or even a phone call to family. It was for his German shepherd. The request defied 30 years of protocol. Officer Martinez dropped his clipboard, the metallic clang reverberating through the stunned silence as 3 guards exchanged bewildered glances. In all their years at Huntsville State Penitentiary, they'd never heard anything like it. The execution chamber waited, prepared and sterile, while Walter Benjamin Hartwell sat in his cell asking for something impossible. Rodriguez remembered the old man's weathered hands, the way they trembled slightly when he spoke of Thunder, the dog who'd waited 7 years for a master who might never come home. Now she held a man's life in her hands with 12 hours left on the clock. "Get me the animal shelter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "And pray we're not too late." What had started as routine paperwork was about to unravel a truth buried for 7 long years. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas prairie as Walter Benjamin Hartwell sat on the edge of his narrow cot, hands clasped in prayer position, eyes fixed on the cold concrete floor. At 68, the retired carpenter bore little resemblance to the man who'd walked through these gates 7 years ago. Time and grief had carved deep lines into his weathered face, transforming sharp defiance into quiet resignation. His once powerful hands, calloused from decades of building homes in Cedar Springs, now trembled slightly as he counted the hours until 6 o'clock. Walter had been a man of simple pleasures before the nightmare began. After his beloved wife Margaret succumbed to cancer 10 years prior, he'd found solace in his work and in the companionship of Thunder, a magnificent German shepherd with intelligent brown eyes and a coat of black and tan that gleamed in the Texas sunlight. Thunder had been his shadow, his confidant, his family when his own children, scattered across distant states, rarely called or visited. The dog's unwavering loyalty had filled the empty spaces in Walter's heart, creating a bond that transcended the typical relationship between man and pet. Thunder, now 15 years old, had spent the last 7 years at Cedar Springs Animal Shelter under the devoted care of Eleanor Sinclair, a 72-year-old volunteer whose own losses had shaped her into a guardian angel for abandoned animals. Eleanor had lost her husband to the jungles of Vietnam and her only son to the deserts of Iraq, leaving her with an empty house and an endless capacity for caring for creatures that others had forgotten. When Thunder arrived at the shelter, traumatized and refusing to eat, something in his mournful eyes spoke to Eleanor's wounded soul. What the authorities didn't know, what Walter himself had never discovered, was that Eleanor Sinclair was the mother of Sarah Mitchell, the woman whose murder had sent Walter to death row. For 7 years, Eleanor had harbored a secret belief in Walter's innocence, a conviction that grew stronger each time she watched Thunder pine for his master. Dogs, she'd learned through decades of rescue work, possessed an intuition about human character that rarely failed them. Thunder's unwavering devotion to Walter spoke louder than any courtroom testimony. The case had been a perfect storm of circumstantial evidence and investigative shortcuts. Detective Ray Morrison, then struggling through a bitter divorce and mounting pressure from the mayor's office to solve the high-profile murder quickly, had built what seemed like an airtight case against Walter. The carpenter's fingerprints at the crime scene, blood on his clothing, and his presence near Sarah's house that fatal evening had convinced a jury of his guilt despite his protests of innocence. Now, as the clock ticked toward his final hour, Walter's only wish was to see Thunder one more time, to look into those loyal brown eyes and say goodbye properly. He had no way of knowing that his simple request would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of the Texas justice system and expose a web of corruption that had festered for years in the very institution sworn to protect the innocent. The emergency meeting convened in Warden Rodriguez's office at 7:30 sharp, the morning light filtering through reinforced windows as 5 officials debated an unprecedented request. Captain James Sullivan, head of security, paced behind his chair like a caged animal, his voice rising with each objection. "Helen, we're talking about bringing an untrained animal into a maximum security facility on execution day. The liability alone could shut us down." Rodriguez leaned back in her leather chair, fingers steepled as she studied the faces around her conference table. Deputy Warden Patricia Hayes shook her head vigorously, pointing to the thick policy manual. "There's no protocol for this, Helen. None. We're in uncharted territory here." But Officer Jake Martinez, a young guard known for his compassion, spoke up quietly from the corner. "With respect, ma'am, the man's got 12 hours left. Thunder's all he's got. No family visits, no letters, nothing for 7 years. Maybe we should let him go in peace." The legal team's representative, Attorney Sarah Chen, warned about setting dangerous precedents while frantically scrolling through case law on her tablet. "If this gets out to the media before we're ready, we'll have animal rights activists and anti-death penalty protesters camping outside our gates." Rodriguez raised her hand for silence, her decision already forming. "Get me the file on Walter Hartwell. I want to know everything about this dog." The file painted a picture of a model prisoner. No fights, no infractions, no escape attempts in 7 years. Under personal effects, a single notation. German Shepherd named Thunder, age unknown, seized at time of arrest, currently housed at Cedar Springs Animal Shelter. Rodriguez picked up her phone with steady hands. "Get me Eleanor Sinclair at the shelter." The phone rang 3 times before a gentle voice answered. "Cedar Springs Animal Shelter, Eleanor speaking." Rodriguez identified herself, hearing the sharp intake of breath on the other end. "Mrs. Sinclair, I'm calling about a dog named Thunder. We have an unusual situation here." As she explained Walter's request, the silence stretched so long Rodriguez wondered if the call had dropped. Eleanor's voice, when it finally came, trembled with barely contained emotion. "Warden, I've been caring for Thunder for 7 years. That dog hasn't been right since the day they took Walter away. Won't eat properly, won't let anyone adopt him, just lies by the gate like he's waiting." Her voice broke slightly. "If you're asking whether I'll bring him to see Walter before tonight, the answer is yes. God help me, yes." The conversation that followed revealed Eleanor's extraordinary dedication. She'd driven Thunder past the prison gates dozens of times over the years, watching the dog's ears perk up and his tail wag hopefully each time they approached. She'd spent thousands of her own Social Security dollars on Thunder's veterinary care, refusing every adoption application with a fierce protectiveness that surprised even her. "That dog belongs with Walter," she whispered into the phone. "If this is their last goodbye, I won't be the one to deny them that." Back in his cell, Walter had declined his final meal, pushing away the untouched tray of fried chicken and mashed potatoes. Chaplain Robert Michaels sat across from him on a metal folding chair, having heard the same profession of innocence countless times over the years. "Walter, my friend, it's time to make peace with the Lord. Confession cleanses the soul." But Walter's blue eyes remained clear and unwavering. "Reverend, I've got nothing to confess except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sarah Mitchell was already dead when I found her." Guard Martinez appeared at the cell door, his young face struggling to contain excitement. "Walter, the warden approved your request. Thunder's coming." For the first time in 7 years, Walter's weathered face cracked into something resembling a smile. His hands, which had been steady all morning, began to shake as the reality sank in. Thunder was coming. His boy was coming home, even if it was just for an hour. Eleanor's preparation ritual began immediately. She bathed Thunder with special care, brushing his coat until it gleamed like black silk with tan highlights. At 15, the German Shepherd moved with the careful dignity of an elder, his muzzle gray but his dark eyes still sharp and intelligent. As Eleanor clipped on his best collar, a simple leather band Walter had made himself years ago, Thunder seemed to sense something momentous was happening. His tail began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. The drive to Huntsville State Penitentiary took 45 minutes, Thunder riding in the passenger seat with his head out the window, ears pricked forward as familiar scents grew stronger. Eleanor watched him transform before her eyes, the listless depression that had plagued him for years melting away like morning frost. "You know where we're going, don't you, boy?" she whispered, her own heart racing with anticipation and dread. The prison's imposing facade of concrete and razor wire came into view at 10:15, and Thunder's entire body began to vibrate with excitement. Eleanor had never seen him so animated, his powerful frame trembling as he whined softly, a sound caught between joy and grief. She parked in the designated visitor area, her hands shaking as she signed the mountain of paperwork required for this unprecedented visit. Officer Martinez met them at the first checkpoint, his demeanor gentle as he explained the procedures. Thunder would be allowed in the yard for exactly 1 hour, under strict supervision, with Walter's hands cuffed loosely in front to allow for contact. As they walked through the security gates, Eleanor felt the weight of 7 years of waiting, 7 years of hoping, 7 years of believing in something that everyone else had given up on. Walter stood in the center of the prison yard when the far gate creaked open, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast against the gray concrete walls. His heart hammered against his ribs as he saw Eleanor first, then the familiar black and tan form trotting beside her. Thunder's ears shot forward the moment he spotted Walter, his entire body language transforming from cautious observation to explosive joy. The leash went slack in Eleanor's hands as Thunder surged forward, his powerful legs carrying him across the yard in bounds that defied his age. Walter dropped to his knees just as Thunder slammed into his chest, nearly knocking him backward with the force of 15 years of love and 7 years of separation. The dog pressed his massive head against Walter's shoulder, whining with a sound that spoke of loneliness, loyalty, and a love that prison walls could never contain. For a moment, the prison vanished. The guards, the cameras, the countdown to 6 o'clock, none of it mattered. There was only an old man and his dog, reunited against all odds, holding on to each other as if they could stop time itself through the sheer force of their devotion. Walter buried his face in Thunder's thick coat, breathing in the familiar scent of home, leather, earth, and something indefinably comforting that spoke of morning walks and quiet evenings on the porch. His tears fell freely onto the German Shepherd's fur, 7 years of suppressed emotion pouring out as Thunder's warm tongue found his cheek. The dog's powerful body trembled against him, whines of joy mixed with what sounded almost like sobs as Thunder pressed closer as if trying to merge their very souls. Eleanor stood 20 feet away, her own tears flowing as she watched the reunion she'd dreamed of for years. Officer Martinez wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, while even the hardened prison guards found themselves moved by the raw emotion before them. Thunder refused to let Walter out of his sight, circling him protectively, nose constantly checking his scent as if to confirm this wasn't another cruel dream. "Easy, boy," Walter whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I'm here. I'm really here." Thunder's tail wagged with such force his entire back end swayed, the simple joy in his movement a stark contrast to the concrete walls surrounding them. For 15 precious minutes they simply held each other, man and dog reunited in a bubble of love that seemed to push back against the harsh reality of their situation. But then Thunder's behavior changed. His ears snapped to attention, swiveling toward the administrative building. His body went rigid, the joyful whining replaced by a low, rumbling growl that started deep in his chest. Walter felt the shift immediately, his hand still tangled in Thunder's fur as the dog's attention fixed on something beyond their reunion. Thunder's nose lifted, testing the air with the precision of a creature bred for detection work. His muscles tensed, and he took several steps toward the eastern wall of the yard, pulling Walter along with surprising strength. The growling intensified, punctuated by sharp, warning barks that echoed off the concrete walls like gunshots. "What's got into him?" Officer Martinez asked, stepping closer with concern. Eleanor approached cautiously, recognizing the behavior from her years of working with military and police dogs at the shelter. "That's an alert posture," she said quietly. "He's detecting something specific, something that's got him upset." Thunder's powerful nose led him to a corner of the yard where a small maintenance shed stood against the fence. He began scratching at the ground with his front paws, the same methodical digging motion Walter remembered from their hunting trips when Thunder would unearth buried treasures in the woods. Dirt flew behind him as his claws worked the hard-packed earth with determination. Walter knelt beside his dog, confusion mixing with curiosity. "What is it, boy? What'd you find?" Thunder's digging intensified, his breathing rapid and focused. The guards exchanged nervous glances, uncertain whether to intervene or allow the strange behavior to continue. Eleanor approached with the calm confidence of someone who'd spent decades interpreting animal behavior. "Thunder, show us," she commanded gently, using the tone she'd learned from her late son's military dog handling manuals. Thunder responded immediately, his digging becoming more precise, more urgent. After several minutes of concentrated effort, his claws struck something metallic. A few more scrapes revealed the corner of what appeared to be a small ammunition box, military green and weathered with age. Officer Martinez radioed for assistance as Thunder backed away from his discovery, still alert but allowing the humans to take over. With careful hands, Martinez extracted the buried container, its weight suggesting significant contents. The box was locked, but years of burial had corroded the simple clasp enough that it gave way with minimal pressure. Inside, wrapped in deteriorating plastic bags, lay items that made everyone's blood run cold. Work gloves, stained dark with what could only be blood but in a size clearly too large for Walter's weathered carpenter hands. A photograph showed Sarah Mitchell smiling beside a man none of them recognized. Tall, dark-haired, wearing what appeared to be a police uniform. Most damning of all, a hotel receipt dated the night of Sarah's murder, paid for with a credit card bearing the name J. Crawford. Eleanor's hands shook as she examined the photograph. "That's not Walter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I've never seen this man before in my life." Thunder remained alert, pacing in tight circles around the group, his instincts clearly telling him there was more to discover. Martinez immediately called Warden Rodriguez, his voice tight with excitement and confusion. "Ma'am, you need to get down to the yard immediately. Thunder found something. Evidence. Real evidence that doesn't match Walter's case file." The warden's response was swift and decisive. "Secure the scene, photograph everything, and contact the district attorney's office immediately." Within an hour, the prison yard had transformed into a crime scene investigation. Detective Morrison arrived with a full forensics team, his face pale as he examined the contents of the buried box. The name J. Crawford triggered immediate recognition. Jimmy Crawford had been a prison groundskeeper during Walter's early years of incarceration, but had died of a heart attack 2 years prior. "This doesn't make sense," Morrison muttered, studying the photograph with growing unease. Crawford was cleared early in the investigation. He had an alibi. He was working a double shift at the prison that night. But Eleanor's sharp eyes caught something else, something that made her heart race with a mixture of hope and horror. "Look at the timestamp on this hotel receipt," she said, pointing to the small numbers at the bottom. "This was paid for at 11:47 p.m. The coroner estimated Sarah's time of death between 10:30 and 11:15. Whoever this Jay Crawford is, he was getting a hotel room less than an hour after Sarah died." Thunder's behavior grew increasingly agitated as more officials arrived on the scene. He kept returning to the spot where he'd found the box, sniffing and pawing at the ground as if searching for something else. His military bloodline heritage was showing. German shepherds bred for detection work possessed olfactory capabilities 50 times more sensitive than the average dog, and Thunder's nose was telling him a story that humans had missed for 7 years. Eleanor knelt beside Thunder, running her hands along his flanks to calm him. "What else is there, boy? What else do you smell?" Thunder's response was immediate. He trotted to the other side of the yard near the entrance gate and began the same alert behavior. This time, his nose led him to a drainage grate near the fence line. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the prison yard, the investigation took on an urgency that had nothing to do with Walter's approaching execution time. Thunder had uncovered physical evidence that contradicted the entire prosecution case, evidence that had been literally buried beneath their feet for years. But even as hope began to bloom in Walter's chest for the first time in 7 years, questions multiplied faster than answers. Who was the man in the photograph with Sarah? Why had Jimmy Crawford's alibi gone unquestioned when evidence suggested he was at the crime scene? And most disturbing of all, if Crawford was involved in Sarah's murder, how had Walter's DNA and fingerprints ended up at the scene? Officer Martinez looked at his watch and felt his stomach clench. It was already past noon, and Walter's execution was scheduled for 6 o'clock. Even if this evidence proved his innocence, would there be enough time to navigate the legal system and save his life? Thunder seemed to sense the urgency, his pacing becoming more frantic as he continued to alert to scents that only his extraordinary nose could detect. Eleanor stood in the center of the chaos, watching Thunder work with the precision of a trained investigator, and felt a chill run down her spine. For 7 years, she'd believed in Walter's innocence based on Thunder's unwavering loyalty. Now, as the dog methodically uncovered evidence that had been hidden from the investigation, she realized that Thunder hadn't just been waiting for his master to come home, he'd been guarding the truth. The investigation took on a desperate urgency as the afternoon sun climbed higher over Huntsville State Penitentiary. Thunder's discovery had opened a Pandora's box of questions, and with only 6 hours remaining until Walter's scheduled execution, every minute counted. Detective Morrison found himself in the surreal position of potentially having to overturn his own case, the conviction that had defined his career and haunted his conscience for 7 long years. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he examined the photograph more closely under a magnifying glass. The man standing beside Sarah Mitchell bore no resemblance to Walter Hartwell. This stranger was younger, taller, with the confident posture of someone comfortable with authority. The partial police uniform visible in the shot suggested law enforcement, but Morrison couldn't place the face despite his decades in the department. Eleanor watched Thunder continue his methodical search of the prison yard, her mind racing with implications she'd never dared to consider. For 7 years, she'd cared for this magnificent dog, believing in Walter's innocence based purely on Thunder's unwavering loyalty. Now, watching him work with the precision of a trained detection animal, she realized Thunder possessed capabilities she'd never fully understood. "Mrs. Sinclair," Officer Martinez approached her gently. "Can you tell us more about Thunder's background, his breeding, his training?" Eleanor's weathered hands smoothed Thunder's coat as she spoke. "Sarah got him as a puppy from her boyfriend at the time, Marcus Webb. Marcus was a K-9 handler with the state police, said Thunder came from champion bloodlines, German shepherds bred for military and police work. The revelation sent shockwaves through the assembled officials. If Thunder possessed inherited detection abilities, his behavior in the yard wasn't random. It was purposeful, methodical, professional. Thunder was following scent trails that had been invisible to human investigators for 7 years, trails that could lead to the real killer. Morrison's radio crackled to life with an urgent message from headquarters. The forensics team had run preliminary tests on the items from the buried box. The blood on the work gloves wasn't Walter's. It belonged to Sarah Mitchell and an unknown male contributor. More significantly, the hotel receipt's credit card records revealed that Jay Crawford wasn't Jimmy Crawford, the deceased groundskeeper, but rather someone who had used a false identity. As the investigation deepened, a disturbing pattern began to emerge from Walter's case files. Morrison discovered that several witness statements had never been properly followed up, including a waitress at the local diner who claimed to have seen Sarah Mitchell arguing with an unknown man the night she died. The witness had been interviewed once, briefly, and then dismissed when her description didn't match Walter. Walter sat in stunned silence as the developments unfolded around him. For 7 years, he'd maintained his innocence to anyone who would listen: lawyers, chaplains, fellow inmates, guards. Now, watching Thunder systematically uncover evidence that supported his claims, he felt a mixture of vindication and bitter irony. His dog was accomplishing what an entire legal team had failed to do. Thunder's work in the yard continued with mechanical precision. He'd identified 3 distinct areas of interest: the location where he'd found the buried box, a spot near the drainage grate by the fence, and surprisingly, an area near the administrative building where Detective Morrison had parked his patrol car. Each location triggered the same alert behavior: rigid posture, focused attention, and low warning growls that spoke of deeply embedded memories. Eleanor began to piece together a timeline that nobody had considered. "What if Thunder was there that night?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the investigative chatter. "What if he witnessed Sarah's murder?" The group fell silent as the implications sank in. German shepherds were known for their exceptional memory, particularly when associated with traumatic events. If Thunder had been present during Sarah's death, his current behavior might be more than detection, it might be recognition. Morrison's phone rang, interrupting the revelation. The caller was FBI agent Patricia Reeves, who'd been monitoring local police communications as part of an ongoing investigation into regional law enforcement corruption. "Detective Morrison, we need to talk. The credit card used for that hotel receipt, it's connected to an identity theft ring we've been tracking for 3 years. Someone's been using stolen identities to cover their tracks." The federal involvement elevated the case to a new level of complexity. Agent Reeves arrived at the prison within the hour, bringing with her a team of specialists and a wealth of information that cast the original investigation in a disturbing new light. The corruption investigation had identified several questionable cases in the region, all characterized by rushed investigations, missing evidence, and convictions based heavily on circumstantial evidence. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the prison yard, Thunder's behavior became increasingly focused on one particular area: the administrative parking lot where Detective Morrison's patrol car sat. The dog's agitation reached a crescendo as he approached the vehicle, his powerful body trembling with what could only be described as recognition mixed with fear. Eleanor knelt beside Thunder, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "What is it, boy? What do you remember?" Thunder's response was unlike anything she'd seen in 7 years of caring for him. He began to whine, not the joyful sound of reunion with Walter, but a keening, mournful cry that spoke of trauma and loss. His eyes remained fixed on Morrison's car, his entire being focused on something invisible to human senses. Morrison himself seemed to shrink under Thunder's intense scrutiny. The detective's face had grown pale, and his hands shook as he fumbled with his keys. "The dog's just confused," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "All police cars probably smell the same to him." Agent Reeves, however, was watching Morrison with the trained eye of someone who'd spent years identifying deception. "Detective Morrison," Agent Reeves spoke with quiet authority, "I'm going to need you to open your patrol car for inspection. We need to eliminate all possible contamination sources for Thunder's alerts." Morrison's hesitation was barely perceptible, but Thunder's reaction was immediate and dramatic. The dog's whining intensified, and he began pawing at the ground in the same methodical pattern he'd used to uncover the buried evidence. The truth began to unravel with devastating swiftness. Morrison's patrol car yielded trace evidence that forensics would later match to the crime scene: fibers, hair, and most damning of all, Sarah Mitchell's DNA in the trunk compartment. But it was Thunder's behavior that provided the most chilling revelation. As the car was opened, the dog's reaction was so violent that Eleanor had to physically restrain him to prevent him from attacking Morrison. "He recognizes the scent," Eleanor whispered in horror. "Thunder was there. He saw what happened to Sarah." The implications crashed over the assembled group like a tidal wave. Thunder hadn't just found evidence, he was providing eyewitness testimony in the only way available to him. His alerts, his recognition, his 7 years of depression and loyalty to Walter all painted a picture that human investigators had missed entirely. Morrison's composure finally cracked under the weight of accumulating evidence and Thunder's unmistakable recognition. "You don't understand," he said, his voice breaking. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Sarah was supposed to just disappear, relocate, start over. The corruption investigation, she was going to bring down half the department." Agent Reeves stepped forward, her hand moving instinctively to her service weapon. "Detective Morrison, you're under arrest for the murder of Sarah Mitchell." But Morrison raised his hands, tears streaming down his face as 7 years of guilt finally found voice. "I didn't kill her. I was there, I covered it up, but I didn't pull the trigger." The confession that followed shattered everything the legal system thought it knew about Sarah Mitchell's death. Morrison revealed a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of local law enforcement. Sarah hadn't been a random victim. She'd been an FBI informant gathering evidence against a drug trafficking operation run through the police department's evidence room. Chief Davis, Morrison's superior, had discovered Sarah's true role and ordered her elimination. Morrison's job was simply to ensure the investigation pointed away from the department, but Walter's presence at the scene had provided the perfect scapegoat. The evidence had been planted, witnesses intimidated or ignored, and Walter's conviction had closed the case while protecting the real criminals. Thunder's role in the cover-up had been overlooked because no one had considered that the dog might be a witness. On the night of Sarah's murder, Thunder had been in the house when Chief Davis arrived. The dog had hidden during the violence but had absorbed every scent, every sound, every detail of the crime. When Walter arrived to find Sarah's body, Thunder was already traumatized, and in the chaos that followed, no one thought to consider what the dog might have experienced. Eleanor's voice was barely a whisper as she processed the revelation. "Thunder's been carrying this trauma for 7 years. He knew Walter was innocent because he saw who really killed Sarah." The dog in question sat quietly beside Walter now, his alerts finished, his duty complete. For the first time since the investigation began, Thunder seemed at peace, as if finally being believed had lifted a weight from his loyal heart. As the afternoon wore on, the legal machinery ground into motion with unprecedented speed. The governor's office was contacted, appeals were filed, and Walter's execution was stayed pending a full investigation. But even as hope bloomed in Walter's chest, the magnitude of the corruption being exposed cast a shadow over the entire proceedings. Agent Reeves coordinated with federal prosecutors as more evidence surfaced. Chief Davis was arrested at his home, and several other officers were taken into custody as the scope of the trafficking operation became clear. The case that had seemed so straightforward 7 years ago was revealed to be a carefully constructed frame-up designed to protect a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for nearly a decade. Walter watched the chaos unfold around him with a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. 7 years of his life had been stolen. 7 years of Thunder's loyalty had been tested, and 7 years of Eleanor's faith had finally been proven justified. But the cost, to all of them, was incalculable. As evening approached and the execution time passed without incident, Walter found himself sitting in a holding cell rather than facing death. Thunder lay beside him, finally allowed to stay close while Eleanor sat nearby, her hand resting on the dog's head. The three of them, bound together by tragedy, separation, and an unshakable belief in truth, waited for justice to finally, truly be served. The investigation would continue for months, unraveling years of corruption and freeing other wrongfully convicted individuals. But in that moment, in a prison cell that no longer held a condemned man, an old carpenter, his faithful dog, and the woman who'd believed in both of them simply held on to each other and marveled at the power of loyalty to reveal truth. The federal courthouse in Houston erupted into chaos as news of Walter Hartwell's exoneration spread through the corridors like wildfire. Emergency hearings convened as FBI agent Patricia Reeves presented evidence that would dismantle the largest police corruption ring in Texas history. But in the eye of the storm sat Walter, Thunder, and Eleanor, three souls bound together by 7 years of unwavering faith, now vindicated by the most unlikely detective of all. Chief Robert Davis paced his holding cell like a caged animal, his 25-year career in law enforcement crumbling with each revelation. The man who had commanded respect throughout Cedar Springs and beyond now faced charges that could put him away for life. His carefully constructed facade of integrity had been shattered by a German shepherd's perfect memory and an old man's simple request to see his dog one last time. Detective Morrison sat in an adjacent cell, his confession having opened floodgates that investigators were still trying to navigate. "You have to understand," he repeated to Agent Reeves during his formal interview, his voice hoarse from hours of testimony. "Davis didn't give us choices. Sarah Mitchell was gathering evidence about our evidence room. Drugs were being resold, money laundered through department accounts. When Davis found out she was FBI, he went ballistic." The scope of the corruption was staggering. For nearly a decade, confiscated drugs had been recycled back onto the streets through a network of dealers who paid protection money directly to Davis and his inner circle. Sarah Mitchell's role as an informant had threatened to expose not just the drug operation, but connections to organized crime families across 3 states. Her murder had been ordered to protect an empire built on betrayed oaths and stolen evidence. Thunder remained at Walter's side throughout the legal proceedings, his presence a constant reminder of the loyalty that had ultimately brought justice. The German shepherd seemed to understand that his work was complete, displaying a calmness that contrasted sharply with his agitated behavior during the investigation. Eleanor watched him with wonder, finally comprehending the depth of trauma he'd carried for 7 years. "He never forgot," she whispered to Walter during a brief recess. "All this time I thought he was grieving for you. But he was grieving for Sarah too, carrying the memory of what he witnessed that night." Walter's weathered hand stroked Thunder's graying muzzle, marveling at the intelligence behind those dark brown eyes. He protected the truth when no one else would listen. The media descended on the story with an intensity that surprised even seasoned law enforcement officials. "Dog solves murder, saves innocent man from execution" became headlines across the nation, transforming Thunder from a forgotten shelter animal into an unlikely hero. Television crews waited outside the courthouse, eager to capture footage of the German Shepherd who had accomplished what human investigators had failed to do. But the attention came with a cost. Eleanor found herself thrust into a spotlight she'd never sought, forced to relive the pain of losing her daughter while simultaneously celebrating the vindication of the man wrongly accused of killing her. The emotional complexity of her situation, caring for the dog of a man she'd initially believed killed her child, resonated with people across the country who grappled with their own conflicts between justice and forgiveness. Walter's own children finally made contact after 7 years of silence, their voices choked with shame and regret during tearful phone calls from distant states. His daughter Rebecca flew in from California, her face streaked with tears as she embraced the father she'd abandoned in his darkest hour. "I'm so sorry, Daddy," she sobbed against his shoulder. "I should have believed you. I should have fought for you." The reunion was bittersweet, tainted by years of missed birthdays, holidays, and simple conversations that could never be recovered. Walter's son David arrived from Michigan with his own family, introducing grandchildren who barely remembered their grandfather except as a source of shame and whispered family secrets. Thunder watched these emotional reunions with the patient wisdom of an animal who understood that healing takes time. As federal investigators dug deeper into the corruption scandal, they uncovered evidence that shook the foundation of the entire regional justice system. Davis's operation had influenced dozens of cases over the years, with evidence planted, witnesses intimidated, and verdicts predetermined to protect the drug trafficking network. Walter's case had been just one in a series of judicial manipulations designed to maintain the illusion of law and order while criminals operated with badges and official sanction. The financial cost of the corruption was staggering. Millions of dollars in drug money had been laundered through fake police operations, with Davis using his position to legitimize criminal enterprises throughout East Texas. Asset forfeitures had been manipulated to fund personal accounts, while genuine evidence had been destroyed to protect co-conspirators. The breadth of the conspiracy required a federal task force to investigate, with prosecutions expected to continue for years. Eleanor's role in the story captured public imagination in ways that surprised everyone involved. Here was a woman who had lost her daughter to violence, only to spend 7 years caring for the dog of the man accused of the murder. Her faith in Walter's innocence, based primarily on Thunder's behavior and her own intuitive sense of justice, had proved more accurate than an entire legal system staffed with trained professionals. "I never stopped believing," she told reporters during a carefully managed press conference outside the courthouse. "Thunder knew Walter was innocent. Dogs don't lie. They don't have hidden agendas. They just love and remember and stay faithful to truth even when humans fail them." Her words resonated particularly strongly with older Americans who understood the profound bond between humans and their animal companions. The legal ramifications extended far beyond individual prosecutions. Walter's case became a catalyst for reform discussions about the death penalty, police accountability, and the rights of the wrongfully convicted. Legal scholars pointed to Thunder's role as evidence that the justice system needed to remain open to all forms of truth, even those that challenged conventional investigative methods. Chief Davis's empire began collapsing as former allies rushed to cooperate with federal investigators. Officers who had remained silent for years suddenly found their voices, revealing details about the corruption that painted an even darker picture of institutional failure. The drug trafficking operation had connections to cartels operating along the Mexican border, with Cedar Springs serving as a crucial distribution hub protected by Davis's badge and authority. Walter faced the overwhelming task of rebuilding a life that had been stolen from him. At 68, he emerged from prison to find a world that had moved on without him. Technology had advanced. His modest home had been sold to pay legal fees, and his reputation in Cedar Springs remained tainted despite his exoneration. The state's compensation for wrongful conviction, $80,000 per year served, felt inadequate compared to the lost time and shattered relationships. Thunder's health became a growing concern as the stress of the investigation and media attention took its toll on the aging German Shepherd. At 15, he was already beyond the typical lifespan for his breed, and veterinarians warned that the excitement and travel associated with the case might be shortening his remaining time. Eleanor watched him carefully, noting the increased stiffness in his movements and the longer periods of rest he required. The bond between Walter and Eleanor deepened as they navigated the aftermath of the revelation together. Two people who had been connected by tragedy and separated by circumstances beyond their control found themselves drawn together by shared experience and mutual understanding. Eleanor's care for Thunder had created a bridge between them that transcended the pain of Sarah's death and Walter's wrongful conviction. As autumn approached, the legal proceedings continued their slow march toward justice. Davis faced the death penalty for Sarah's murder, while Morrison and other co-conspirators negotiated plea deals in exchange for continued cooperation. The drug trafficking network was systematically dismantled, with arrests spreading across multiple states as the full scope of the operation became clear. Walter found himself in the strange position of being both victim and symbol. His story had captured national attention, making him a spokesperson for criminal justice reform despite his preference for quiet, private life. Speaking engagements and interview requests poured in, offering financial compensation that could help rebuild his life, but requiring him to relive his trauma repeatedly for public consumption. Thunder's role as the unlikely hero of the story brought attention to the broader relationships between humans and animals in the justice system. Police departments across the country began re-evaluating their K-9 programs, while animal behaviorists offered new insights into the potential for trained animals to assist in criminal investigations. Thunder had inadvertently opened a door to possibilities that had been largely unexplored in American law enforcement. The emotional toll on everyone involved was immense. Eleanor struggled with conflicting feelings about the vindication of Walter and the renewed grief over Sarah's death. Walter grappled with anger over his lost years while trying to maintain gratitude for his freedom. Thunder simply remained faithful, providing comfort and stability as the human world swirled in chaos around him. As the first anniversary of Walter's exoneration approached, the three of them, man, woman, and dog, had become an unlikely family forged by extraordinary circumstances. Their story would continue to unfold, but the foundation had been laid. Truth had prevailed, justice had been served, and the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog had proven stronger than corruption, more persistent than time, and more reliable than human institutions designed to protect the innocent. The bitter irony of freedom struck Walter with devastating force 3 months after his exoneration. While the world celebrated his vindication and Thunder's heroic role in exposing the truth, Walter found himself drowning in a sea of unexpected losses that no legal victory could restore. The modest house in Cedar Springs, where he'd built countless memories with Margaret and raised Thunder from a puppy, had been sold years ago to pay for his inadequate legal defense. His workshop, filled with handcrafted furniture and tools accumulated over 40 years of carpentry, had been auctioned off piece by piece. Eleanor watched Walter's growing depression with the same careful attention she'd once devoted to Thunder's emotional state. The man who had survived 7 years on death row was crumbling under the weight of a freedom that felt more like exile. His children's attempts at reconciliation were stilted and awkward, burdened by guilt and the uncomfortable reality that they had abandoned him when he needed them most. Phone calls grew shorter and less frequent as the initial media attention faded and the family struggled to bridge 7 years of silence and mistrust. Thunder's health began failing rapidly as winter approached, his aging body finally succumbing to the stress of the investigation and the accumulated wear of 15 years. The veterinarian's diagnosis was devastating: advanced kidney disease, arthritis in his hips, and a heart murmur that suggested his time was limited. Eleanor and Walter took turns caring for him, administering medications and providing comfort, but they could see the light dimming in his intelligent brown eyes. The financial settlement from the state, while substantial on paper, felt like blood money to Walter. No amount could compensate for the years stolen from him, the relationships destroyed, or the simple pleasure of growing old with his beloved wife, Margaret. He found himself spending hours sitting by her grave, telling her about Thunder's heroism and the corruption that had nearly cost him his life, but her silence was a painful reminder of all the conversations they would never have. Cedar Springs itself had become a place of painful contradictions for Walter. While some residents embraced him as a victim of injustice, others remained convinced of his guilt despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. The corruption scandal had shattered the community's faith in local law enforcement, leaving residents feeling vulnerable and betrayed. Walking down Main Street, Walter could feel the weight of stares and whispered conversations that followed in his wake. Eleanor faced her own demons as the truth about Sarah's death brought fresh grief mixed with unexpected relief. For 7 years, she had struggled with the belief that her daughter had been killed by a stranger in a random act of violence. Learning that Sarah had been murdered because she was trying to do the right thing, cooperating with federal investigators to expose corruption, gave her death a meaning that was both comforting and heartbreaking. The media attention that had initially seemed like vindication gradually became a burden for all three of them. Reporters continued to seek interviews. Documentary filmmakers requested access, and animal rights organizations wanted to use Thunder's story for their own causes. The constant intrusion made it impossible for Walter and Eleanor to grieve properly or build any semblance of normal life. Thunder, weakened by illness, seemed confused by the strangers who wanted to pet him and take photographs. Detective Morrison's testimony during Chief Davis's trial revealed additional layers of corruption that implicated several other officers and city officials. The revelations destroyed families throughout Cedar Springs as wives learned of their husbands' involvement in drug trafficking and money laundering. Children discovered that their fathers, respected members of the community, had participated in a criminal enterprise that had operated for nearly a decade under the cover of law enforcement. Walter's relationship with his children remained strained despite their attempts at reconciliation. His daughter Rebecca made several visits from California, but the conversations were filled with uncomfortable silences and carefully avoided topics. His son David struggled with explaining to his own children why their grandfather had been in prison, and family gatherings felt forced and artificial. The grandchildren who had been taught to be ashamed of their grandfather now found themselves with a famous relative they barely knew. The wrongful conviction support groups that Walter joined provided some comfort, but they also exposed him to stories of others who had lost even more years to false imprisonment. Meeting men who had spent decades behind bars for crimes they didn't commit put his own 7-year ordeal in perspective, but it also reinforced the arbitrary nature of injustice and the fragility of the legal system that was supposed to protect the innocent. Eleanor's health began to decline under the emotional strain of the past year. The 73-year-old woman had poured her remaining energy into caring for Thunder and supporting Walter through his transition to freedom, but the accumulated stress was taking its toll. Her doctor prescribed medication for high blood pressure and warned her about the dangers of emotional exhaustion, but Eleanor remained focused on providing stability for the two males who had become her makeshift family. Thunder's deterioration accelerated through the fall, his appetite diminishing and his mobility becoming increasingly limited. The dog who had once bounded across the prison yard in joyful reunion with Walter now struggled to climb the steps to Eleanor's front porch. Walter spent hours sitting beside him, stroking his graying coat and whispering words of gratitude for the loyalty that had saved his life. The approaching loss felt like another cruel punishment after years of separation. The financial costs of Thunder's medical care strained Eleanor's fixed income, but she refused Walter's offers to help with expenses. Her Social Security payments and modest savings were being depleted by veterinary bills, but she considered it a small price to pay for the dog who had brought justice to her daughter's murder. Walter felt helpless watching both Eleanor and Thunder sacrifice their remaining resources and energy for his benefit. Chief Davis's trial proceeded with methodical precision, but the legal process provided little emotional satisfaction for those whose lives had been destroyed by his corruption. The former police chief showed no remorse during his testimony, maintaining that his actions had been necessary to protect the community from drug trafficking. His arrogance and lack of accountability infuriated Walter, who was forced to relive the trauma of his arrest and conviction during his own testimony. The broader implications of the corruption scandal continued to unfold as federal investigators traced connections to other criminal enterprises throughout East Texas. Money laundering operations, witness intimidation, and evidence tampering had infected multiple jurisdictions, requiring extensive review of hundreds of cases. Walter realized that his exoneration was just the beginning of a much larger reckoning with institutional failure and criminal abuse of power. Eleanor's shelter work suffered as she devoted more time to caring for Thunder and supporting Walter. The other animals under her care sensed her distraction and stress, requiring additional attention from volunteers who were already stretched thin. The irony wasn't lost on her that saving one dog, or rather allowing one dog to save others, had compromised her ability to help dozens of other abandoned animals who depended on her dedication. As winter deepened and Thunder's condition worsened, Walter found himself confronting the possibility of losing the last connection to his former life. The dog who had waited 7 years for his return, who had endured neglect and abandonment while maintaining unshakable loyalty, was dying just as their reunion should have been bringing them joy. The cruel timing felt like a final injustice in a series of injustices that had defined Walter's recent existence. The small apartment that Walter rented on the outskirts of Cedar Springs felt like a prison of a different sort. Without his workshop, his tools, or the familiar rhythms of his carpentry work, he struggled to find purpose in his newfound freedom. The settlement money provided financial security, but it couldn't restore the sense of identity and belonging that had been stripped away along with his liberty. He was a free man in a world that felt increasingly foreign and unwelcoming. Eleanor and Walter's relationship deepened through their shared care for Thunder, but it was complicated by grief, guilt, and the approaching reality of loss. They had become a family born of extraordinary circumstances, bound together by a dog's love and an old woman's faith in justice. But families, Walter was learning, could be as fragile as they were precious, and the foundation of their connection was literally dying before their eyes. The revelation came like a thunderbolt on a cold December morning, shattering everything Walter and Eleanor thought they knew about the case that had defined their lives. FBI agent Patricia Reeves arrived at Eleanor's modest home with a manila folder thick with documents and the expression that spoke of sleepless nights spent unraveling threads of deception that reached back decades. Thunder lay on his favorite blanket near the fireplace, his breathing labored but his ears still alert to the tension in the room. "There's something else," Agent Reeves began, her voice heavy with the weight of revelation. "Something that changes everything we thought we knew about Sarah's murder and Chief Davis's operation." She spread crime scene photographs and financial records across Eleanor's kitchen table, pointing to details that had been overlooked for 7 years. Davis wasn't the mastermind. He was middle management in an operation that goes back to the 1980s. Walter felt his stomach clench as the agent continued her explanation. The corruption network had been established by Davis's predecessor, Chief Harold Franklin, who had retired 5 years before Sarah's murder with full honors and a generous pension. Franklin had built the drug trafficking operation from the ground up, recruiting younger officers like Davis and creating a system that could survive changes in leadership. Davis had inherited the empire, but Franklin remained the shadow puppet master, pulling strings from his comfortable retirement. Eleanor's hands trembled as she examined photographs of her daughter meeting with various men over the months before her death. Sarah hadn't just been gathering evidence about current corruption, she had uncovered the historical foundation of the entire operation. Her murder hadn't been a panicked reaction to discovery. It had been a calculated execution ordered by Franklin to protect decades of criminal enterprise. The hotel receipt with the false name J. Crawford, Agent Reeves pointed to the evidence that Thunder had helped uncover. That credit card was linked to an identity theft ring run by Franklin's nephew, Jerome Franklin. He's been providing false documentation for the operation for years, including the fake alibi that cleared Jimmy Crawford in the original investigation. Thunder lifted his graying head from his blanket, his cloudy eyes focusing on the photographs scattered across the table. Even in his weakened state, he seemed to recognize the scent of old paper and developing chemicals that clung to the crime scene images. Eleanor reached down to comfort him, her own heart racing as the implications of the revelation became clear. The truth was more horrifying than anyone had imagined. Franklin had been systematically eliminating threats to his operation for decades, with at least 6 suspicious deaths now being reinvestigated by federal authorities. Sarah Mitchell hadn't been his first victim. She had been the latest in a series of murders disguised as robberies, accidents, and suicides. Walter's case had been just another cover-up in a pattern of violence that stretched back to Franklin's early years as chief. Detective Morrison's cooperation had initially seemed complete, but Agent Reeves revealed that even his confession had been incomplete. Morrison had been protecting his own family from Franklin's reach, knowing that full disclosure would put his ex-wife and children at risk. Franklin's network included connections to organized crime families who specialized in witness intimidation and elimination. Morrison's been receiving death threats for months, Agent Reeves explained. Franklin's people made it clear that talking too much would have consequences beyond prison time. That's why we're only getting the full story now. We've finally arrested enough of the network to offer Morrison real protection for his family. Eleanor's mind reeled as she processed the scope of the deception. For 7 years, she had believed that Chief Davis was the monster who had killed her daughter. Now she learned that Davis had been following orders from a man she had known and respected her entire life. Harold Franklin had been a pillar of the Cedar Springs community, a man who had coached Little League baseball and donated generously to local charities while simultaneously running a criminal empire that destroyed lives. Walter's anger burned white-hot as he realized the full extent of his victimization. Not only had he been framed for a murder he didn't commit, but he had been sacrificed to protect a decades-long criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity under the cover of law enforcement. Franklin had watched Walter's trial, had probably attended community events where Walter's conviction was discussed, all while knowing the truth about Sarah's death. The financial records revealed the staggering scope of Franklin's operation. Over 25 years, his network had laundered millions of dollars through legitimate businesses, real estate investments, and charitable organizations. The drug trafficking had been just one component of a broader criminal enterprise that included money laundering, extortion, and murder for hire. Cedar Springs had been the headquarters for an operation that reached across multiple states. Thunder's deteriorating condition seemed to accelerate as the investigation deepened, as if the old dog understood that his work was not yet finished. Eleanor noticed that he perked up whenever Agent Reeves visited with new evidence, his detection instincts still functioning despite his physical decline. The German shepherd who had unlocked the truth about Sarah's murder was now witnessing the exposure of an even larger conspiracy. Agent Reeves explained that Franklin's retirement had been carefully planned to coincide with increased federal scrutiny of regional law enforcement. He had transferred day-to-day operations to Davis, while maintaining control through threats and financial incentives. Franklin's legitimate retirement activities, fishing, woodworking, and volunteer work, had provided perfect cover for his continued oversight of the criminal network. The revelation about Franklin's true role explained many of the inconsistencies that had puzzled investigators. The sophisticated planning behind Walter's frame-up, the coordination required to plant evidence and intimidate witnesses, and the speed with which the case had been closed all pointed to someone with decades of experience in manipulation and cover-ups. Davis had been competent but not brilliant. Franklin was a criminal mastermind who had perfected his methods over years of practice. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of grief as she realized that her daughter's death had been even more cold-blooded than she had imagined. Sarah hadn't died because she had stumbled onto corruption. She had been deliberately targeted because Franklin's network had identified her as an FBI informant. The murder had been planned and executed with the precision of a military operation, with Walter selected as the perfect patsy. The evidence against Franklin was overwhelming but circumstantial, requiring the cooperation of multiple witnesses who had remained silent for decades out of fear. Agent Reeves explained that the federal task force was offering witness protection to anyone willing to testify about Franklin's operation, but many potential witnesses remained terrified of retribution against their families. Walter's exoneration, which had initially seemed like the end of his ordeal, now appeared to be just the beginning of a much larger reckoning. Franklin's arrest would require dismantling an entire network of corruption that had infected every level of local government and law enforcement. The implications were so vast that federal prosecutors were considering bringing in additional resources from Washington. Thunder's health crisis reached a turning point as winter deepened, his kidneys failing despite the best veterinary care that Eleanor and Walter could provide. The dog who had been the key to unlocking decades of corruption was dying just as the full scope of his discovery was being revealed. Eleanor and Walter took shifts, sitting with him through the long nights, whispering words of gratitude and love while he struggled for each breath. The arrest of Harold Franklin sent shock waves through Cedar Springs that dwarfed the initial reaction to Davis's corruption charges. Franklin had been a beloved figure in the community, a man whose family had lived in the area for generations and whose reputation had seemed unassailable. His involvement in drug trafficking and murder shattered the last vestiges of trust in local institutions. Eleanor's role in the expanding investigation became more complex as agents discovered that Franklin had been monitoring her activities for years. Her care for Thunder hadn't gone unnoticed by the criminal network, and surveillance records showed that Franklin's people had considered eliminating both her and Walter to prevent any future discoveries. Only the high-profile nature of Walter's exoneration had protected them from becoming additional victims. The truth about Franklin's operation provided answers to questions that had haunted Walter for years. But it also raised new concerns about the scope of corruption in American law enforcement. If a small-town police chief could run a criminal empire for decades without detection, what other conspiracies might be operating in communities across the country? Walter's case had become a symbol of systemic failure that reached far beyond Cedar Springs. As Thunder's breathing became more labored and his periods of consciousness grew shorter, Walter and Eleanor prepared themselves for the loss of the remarkable animal who had saved Walter's life and brought justice to Sarah's memory. The German Shepherd's legacy would extend far beyond their personal story, inspiring reforms in criminal justice and animal-assisted investigations that would protect future generations from the kind of corruption that had nearly cost Walter his life. The final revelation was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Thunder had been carrying the burden of truth for 7 years, waiting patiently for the moment when someone would finally listen to what his extraordinary senses had been trying to communicate. His loyalty hadn't just saved Walter. It had exposed a criminal conspiracy that had operated with impunity for decades, ensuring that justice would finally be served for Sarah Mitchell and countless other victims. Thunder passed away peacefully on a snow-covered January morning, his great heart finally giving out, as Walter held him close and Eleanor whispered words of love and gratitude. The German shepherd who had waited 7 years for justice drew his last breath surrounded by the two people who had come to understand that family isn't always defined by blood, but sometimes by the extraordinary bonds forged through shared adversity and unwavering faith. 6 months later, Walter and Eleanor stood together in the backyard of their new home, a modest farmhouse on the outskirts of Cedar Springs where Thunder's ashes rested beneath a magnificent oak tree. The federal government settlement had provided Walter with financial security beyond his needs, and Eleanor's decision to share her remaining years with the man her daughter's murder case had brought into her life felt like the most natural thing in the world. The corruption trials had concluded with Harold Franklin receiving a life sentence without parole, his decades-long criminal empire finally dismantled by the very dog he had probably never considered a threat. Chief Davis followed his former mentor to federal prison, while Detective Morrison's cooperation earned him a reduced sentence and enrollment in witness protection. The ripple effects of the investigation had led to reforms in police departments across Texas and federal oversight that would prevent such systematic corruption from taking root again. Walter's children had gradually rebuilt their relationships with their father, though the scars of 7 lost years would never fully heal. His grandchildren, now old enough to understand their grandfather's story, visited regularly and marveled at the framed newspaper clippings that told Thunder's heroic tale. Rebecca had moved back to Texas to be closer to her father, while David made monthly trips from Michigan with his family. Eleanor found unexpected joy in her role as Walter's companion and unofficial stepmother to his children and grandchildren. At 74, she had discovered that life still held surprises and second chances, even after losing both her husband and daughter. Her animal shelter work continued with renewed purpose, as Thunder's story had brought national attention and funding to rescue organizations across the country. The small guest room in their farmhouse had been converted into a memorial space for Thunder, filled with photographs, awards, and letters from people whose lives had been touched by his story. The governor of Texas had posthumously awarded Thunder the State Medal of Courage, the first time such an honor had been bestowed on an animal. Walter built a custom display case for the medal, his carpenter's hands steady once again as he worked with the tools that Eleanor had helped him replace. On quiet evenings, Walter and Eleanor would sit on their front porch watching the sunset paint the Texas sky in shades of gold and crimson. Sometimes they would talk about Sarah, about Thunder, about the extraordinary chain of events that had brought them together. More often, they would simply enjoy the peaceful silence, grateful for the time they had been given and the love they had found in the most unexpected circumstances. Their story had become legend in Cedar Springs and beyond, a testament to the power of loyalty, the persistence of truth, and the healing that can come when people choose forgiveness over bitterness. Walter had learned that second chances are precious gifts not to be wasted, while Eleanor had discovered that family can be found in the most unlikely places. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, they would think of Thunder, knowing that somewhere in the cosmos, a faithful German shepherd was finally at peace, his duty complete, and his love eternal. At 68, Walter discovered that life's greatest gifts often come wrapped in our deepest sorrows. After losing 7 years to wrongful imprisonment, he found himself blessed with Eleanor's companionship and Thunder's unwavering loyalty, proving that family isn't always born, but sometimes chosen through shared trials and mutual faith. Their story reminds us that even in our golden years, second chances await those who refuse to surrender hope. Walter and Eleanor's late-in-life love, built on forgiveness and understanding, shows that it's never too late to find happiness, purpose, and belonging. Thunder's devotion teaches us that love transcends time and circumstances, whether from our faithful pets or the unexpected people who enter our lives when we need them most. For those of us who've weathered decades of life's storms, Walter's journey from death row to a peaceful farmhouse porch offers profound comfort. Our hardest chapters aren't our final ones. True contentment often arrives not in youth's passion, but in wisdom's quiet moments, sharing sunsets with someone who understands our scars, surrounded by the simple joys we once took for granted. Sometimes God's greatest blessings come on 4 legs, or through the kindness of strangers who become family. What unexpected blessing has arrived in your later years that you never saw coming? Have you ever experienced the kind of unwavering loyalty that Thunder showed Walter, either from a pet or a person? Share your stories in the comments below. Your experiences might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.